I don't know. I'm trying to be as quiet as I can.
Don't worry about it. I'm good.
Chag Hanukkah Sameach.
Are you able to hear me now? Good. I was having microphone issues. We are going to begin in just a minute. I'm going to turn off my video for just a second because I have to help someone with something, but I'll continue to let people in.
You want to come around here? This rabbi has.
How we doing?
Oh, that's so. Oh, Phil.
See, how we doing? All right.
Keep picking it. That's why I gave it away. You can't see us, huh? You don't have to be seen. It's very bright. Nathan, liturgy.
Call from
He really got old looking, didn't he, Phil?
Who's that up there? On the right.
It's another, what do you call it, lawyer or congregant. Not a bad looking guy, huh?
Hold.
His name is Joel Rubin.
Who's here? Oy Hanukkah, Yontiv Hashener. Alles tekira freilich en het noch azayna. Alle Nacht mit Reilach spielen mir. Zudik hese latjes essen mir. Am I being heard? Hi, Joel. How are you?
I am fine, Phil. How are you?
Yeah. When are we ever going to get back in town again? Who knows? I don't know. I've been done some of the court stuff, the court stuff, the judge pro tem stuff. And I got noticed they want to be an arbitrator, and I'm just reluctant to do it in person. I don't know. I'm just not comfortable. I don't know. And now it looks like it's getting worse again. Who knows?
They don't know. Everything's up in the air.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much you can control about
He's a nice little guy.
insisting that people are
Why are we
vaccinated.
settling for old people?
Who's gonna, we're old.
But if we're picking people out, we don't have to pick out old people.
Yeah, he looks like Fred.
Where-
He does.
what's wrong? It's just 2 minutes. Where is everybody?
Should we get in on it?
Huh?
Hmm.
Say hi.
This is the right thing. Okay.
Here's my cursor. I'm trying to get my arrow. Where is the arrow?
There it is.
Okay, I want to go down here. Hi,
Hi,
Phil.
Phil.
Wait, there is.
Oh, hi. How you guys
Altoona-
doing?
We're in Altoona,
Look
Pennsylvania.
who's, oh, both of you are there. Where are you?
You get two for the price of one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Were you at the shore in the site? Were you at the shore in the summer?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah,
3,
yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'm in Margate. I mean, I walked a lot and lots of walking.
uh-huh.
I drive, a lot of times I drive down to the boardwalk, Ventnor, and then I went all the way down.
I rode my bike a lot down there. Yeah. How's your family?
We're doing okay.
Good.
So all I know is, well, this past week I had yurtzeit for my wife. She died, it's 7 years ago. It's already
Oh, wow.
unbelievable.
I have Frank's coming up, 20 years.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you that. How many years is that?
20
Yeah,
years. since he passed.
20.
20.
Oh, time passes. Continue. Oh, Sandra. Aye. All right. Anyway.
Do you ever go down the shore in the winter?
No, not really. I went down one time to, make sure stuff was out of the apartment. In Margate, mostly the whole summer I had my younger son, Ben, Jen, and the kids, they come most of the summer too.
Well, that's nice. I think we saw your daughter at the Down Beach Deli.
Oh, did you really? I'm not surprised.
My son got married a month ago.
Oh,
Steve.
Mazel Tov. Isn't that nice? That's
Yeah.
wonderful. I mean, I'm up to this 6 grandchildren. The eldest one is 23 and the youngest one is 7.
Whoa.
Oh, Rachel, my daughter's teaches at Perlman. She's been doing it. It's at least 25 years worth already.
Oh, my
My
goodness.
goodness. Unbelievable.
How's Isaac doing?
Isaac's doing good. He's he's a stroke specialist neurology and up in West Hartford, Connecticut.
Gotcha.
He's doing good.
Hi, Ben Fion.
Sandra, how's your daughter doing?
Hello.
Struggling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Enough of this. All right, it's time to begin. Let's be quiet.
We are going to begin in just a second. I'm letting a few more people in. They're joining. And we'll go from there.
Yeah.
It's good to see everyone.
Oy Hanukkah, al yonte vashener. Al lustige rafrele kaneto noch azoine. Alle Nacht mit Redloch spielen wir, so die Käselatges essen wir. Geschwindert sind Kinder, die ewige Lächeln, sagt Al-Hanisim, Leut Gott war die Nisim und kommt Gicher tanzen und kann. Oi, nun, was geht on? How are we doing? 12:32.
Well, why don't we begin? It's good to see everyone.
Same here.
What I thought that we would talk about today is, well, we're going to do the quote unquote real story of Hanukkah or the aftermath of Hanukkah. And in light of what is called confirmation bias. And so we're gonna talk about this in a second. Let me share a screen here. Give me 1 second. I have a new computer and things still learning.
While it's booting up, let me just share something I saw on TV last night before on news media. So some Jewish woman, maybe a reporter, was consulted on the meaning of Hanukkah, And she got into the military victory, but never really got into the subtlety of why do we call it the Festival of Lights? And we don't really focus too much on the military victory and the Maccabees, which I guess you're going to cover.
Yes, I am, though I'm having trouble opening my screen sharing. I don't know why.
His name.
Do you have a problem with Hanukkah, with Christmas seemingly competing with Hanukkah or vice versa?
I keep them separate.
The
Hold on, why
world
is it-
doesn't. The world, thinks that it's the same, but it's the Jewish version.
The world thinks that it's as important a holiday as Christmas is to the Christians, and we know it
Yeah.
isn't.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Probably got elevated over the decades or centuries because of Christmas.
Privacy.
What's happening?
Hold on for 1 second.
Okay. Well, of course,
Okay, there we go. Oh, there we go. I think it's letting me do it now. We're gonna see in just a second if it lets me. Ah, it let me. Look at that.
oh, here we are. Oh,
Can you see?
Yep.
yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay,
Let
we're
me
gonna let
see.
some people in from the waiting room here. Hold on for 1 second.
How many people are here?
Second here. How do I do this?
Participants number 11.
Can't get to the waiting room.
Well, they usually have like 50.
Participants, here we go, admit. Here we go. All right, so hopefully that will let me. I just became a Mac person, but I have not yet,
Congratulations. You have advanced in life.
yeah, but I have not yet figured out how to do it. So don't say congratulations so quickly. It's intuitive, except for if you've been doing it a different way for the last, however many years.
Yeah, for work, I had to switch to Windows, which I hated, but there's plenty of similarities.
So, okay, so here we go. Now that I figured out a new trick on my new computer, this is what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about the challenge that once we have a narrative about something, and once we develop a narrative about something, it is very hard to bust that narrative. And once that happens, or when that happens, we are more likely, and I think society and the way that media and certainly social media has come about with this, we are more likely to adjust the facts to suit our narrative and ignore the facts that cast aspersions on our narrative than we are to objectively look at new information. So the reason I called this Faith Busters, as you can see, is because there was a class at JTS, mostly for the undergraduates. I did not take this class, that was affectionately nicknamed Faith Busters, in which the Bible teacher would basically tell the real version of stories that had been childhood favorites. And all of a sudden, these undergraduates are standing there saying, "You've ruined my childhood Jewish stories." Right? Now, I would make the claim that you haven't ruined them, that you make them, more adult friendly, less pediatric, more challenging, more complex, and all of this is on net a good thing. But I understand the pain, I understand the difficulty, right, of hearing these stories be sort of debunked. So what we're going to do today is, in gentle, loving terms, we are going to do that first to Hanukkah. And then we're going to look and see what happens when a story is sort of undone, and when we are so stubborn in our mindset that we refuse to shift a story, even with new information, evidence, and data. And then we're going to talk about what happens with that in modern society, which is, I think, in many ways, one of the biggest challenges that the polarization of our modern society is currently afflicted with. So when we do that, you're gonna see how this affects the way that we understand our modern day world. But first, we're gonna start with the classical stuff. All right, so here we go. Next slide. All right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Hanukkah is the only significant Chag that does not warrant its own tractate in the Talmud. So you have a tractate Sukkah, you have a tractate Rosh Hashanah, you have a tractate Yoma, which is Yom Kippur. Shavuot less so, but certainly significant attention given to it. And certainly Pesach has one of the longest tractates. And certainly Shabbat, right? So why doesn't Hanukkah have merit its own? And we sort of touched on this a little as people were coming in. The fact is that Hanukkah is a relative to all of these, and in the face of the secular and Christian world in which we live, Hanukkah is not as important as Christmas, right? And it's not as important as Sukkot, and it's not as important as Yom Kippur or Shabbat, or in the hierarchy of holidays, Hanukkah is pretty low. However, that's not really the reason why Hanukkah doesn't merit a tractate of the Talmud. Purim is a good question. Where does Purim stand? It is, I just got a question from someone. Purim has its own tractate. It's tractate Megillah. Now, it covers, all the tractates cover other things. The rabbis are famous about going on tangents. But that's actually a great point, Gordy, in the sense that that in terms of status, Purim and Hanukkah are pretty much at parity, and one of them merits a tractate and the other one doesn't. And here's the reason why. The rabbis didn't love Hanukkah. It's as simple as that. Because the rabbis, or at least their great-grandparents, the rabbis of the Mishnah or their great-grandparents lived in the society that the Maccabees set up after winning the war. So now I'm going to tell you I'm going to take about 5 minutes to tell you the real story of Hanukkah, what actually happened, and what's worse is the aftermath of what happened. So there is no question that there was a sort of religious persecution that was going on with Antiochus. There is no question that that was the case. The reason why Judea was significant at that time was because the Greek Empire was being split into sort of two geographical factions. One taking over, I guess you would say, sort of North Africa, starting at Egypt and going up into the Negev desert, and then going all the way west across North Africa. And the other going from, let's say, what is modern day, like the Sea of Galilee, up towards Turkey and across the Southern European, Northern Mediterranean coast and things like that. And also both of them seeking to go as far east as the Greek Empire did, though there were other empires that were pushing there too. The Greek Empire was falling apart, and they were constantly pushing this border between the Ptolemaic Greeks and the Seleucid Greeks, being the sort of Syrian Greeks, and the Ptolemaic Greeks being the sort of Egyptian Greeks, right? They were constantly pushing their border with these on and off skirmishes. Guess what was right in the middle of the border that kept shifting between these two sort of sub-empires and their vying military realities. You guessed it, Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the outpost. It was essentially the gateway to Jaffa and the Mediterranean Sea. It was the outpost if you wanted to stop and then go north into Europe, if you wanted to go sort of south and east into Africa, and if you were coming the other direction and you had a long trip across a long desert to get to India and the like there, all of that required a stop in what was known as Judea. So it had nothing to do with holy sites or anything like that at this point in time. Christianity wasn't a thing. Judaism was frankly small, but it was all about how can I push my empire just a little bit farther to control this critical strategic outpost that was Jerusalem. Most of the Jews who lived in Judea were incredibly assimilated and Hellenized, secularized. They cared much more about eating their feta and lamb heroes than they did about studying Torah. There was a group of extremists that didn't even live in Jerusalem. They lived on the outskirts of Jerusalem. In an exurb called Modi'in, which right now is a very posh place to live. It's right on the rail line. It's really lovely. It's an incredible place to live. But back then it was kind of backwater. Those were the Maccabees, and they started screaming, oh my gosh, everyone's becoming Greek. This is so terrible. And the Seleucids at this point had sort of pushed in and wanted to exert their Greek Syrian hegemony on the area. So they started to say, well, we certainly don't want anyone practicing a different thing. We want you to be more as Greek as possible. We want you to adopt our culture, our ways. We want to incorporate you into our version of the Greek Empire, and certainly not the Ptolemaic Greeks, and certainly not your own religion. And that was what was going on. That was Antiochus. By the way, Antioch, Syria, has a major city of ancient called Antioch, right? That's what this is. And so that's where the persecution happened. Eventually, Antiochus overstepped. He just got too greedy because most of the Jews were totally cool with him secularizing Judea. And so he overstepped. And you can imagine how this would work, because it would work exactly the same way in secular Jewish society now. Antiochus said, I want you to be Greek. I want you to dress a certain way. And the Maccabees said, we're not going to do that. And he said, I don't want you to give Jewish Hebrew names. I want you to give Greek names. And they said, we're not going to do this, except we're, Mattathias, right? That's a Greek name, right? But that Mattathias is probably what others called him that he hated, right? He was Matityahu, right? Okay. And they went crazy, but most Jews were like, it's not that big a deal. We don't really care so much. It's so good to be Greek. I want to go to the gymnasia, things like that. Oh, you're saying I can't be circumcised if I'm going to compete in the sports events? Okay, so like maybe I won't get circumcised. This feels like not such a nice simcha anyway. So let's not do that. And of course the Maccabees go crazy and they're going, you're ruining Judaism. We need to stick to the Judaism of our ancestors, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine this conversation going on in the Jewish community. And then Antiochus says, yeah, you know what? I also don't want you to study Torah. I really want you to go to the Greek schools, gymnasia. And most of the Jews say, okay, that's fine. And there's this process of secularizing the Jews. And the only people who care about this are the zealots. And then Antiochus takes a few more steps. He decides to go into the arenas of specifically Jewish pride and religious expression. And he erects a statue of Zeus on the Temple Mount. On the Temple Mount. At this point in time, it seems that even the secularists start to say, look, I don't go to the temple so much. It's not my bag. I'm not a shul goer, but like, you don't mess with my shul. Don't mess with my temple. And they say, that's not cool. And so Antiochus starts to get a little pushback even from his loyalists. And he responds to that by saying, you're not boss, I'm boss, I'll show you. And he uses the temple courtyard and the sort of areas where commerce was done just outside the temple and on the courtyard in the women's courtyard and other places as well as sties, point in time. Can you hear me? Did you just lose me or you can hear me? Okay. At this point in time, even the secular Jews start to get angry. They start to get mad and they say, you can't do this. And he says, oh yeah, watch me. And this goes on. And until finally, even the most secular Jews start to align with the Jewish loyalists and even the Jewish zealots to say, this is enough. There is no other hand. We've got to fight this guy. At which point the Maccabees say, this is what I've been saying all along. Now, this should sound incredibly common in the modern day times, where you have Jewish traditionalists saying, this is going to be the end of Judaism. We can't allow this. We can't allow this. They're encroaching on our this. This is anti-Semitism. This is going to be terrible. We have to fight this. And they're right there at the beginning. And what has happened in modern history is that, unfortunately, those people, the zealots, have often been proven right, even if their approach was a little bit headstrong. And that's what ends up happening here. By the way, I think an argument can be made that it's happening in Jewish universalism versus particularism, in the encroaching of both Jewish secularism on one side and Jewish cloisterism on the other side, where you have Jews saying, we are the sole protectors of the faith on the one side, and anything else is illegitimate and you're terrible. And on the other side saying we can be authentically Jewish and whatever we want. And yeah, maybe there was a little anti-Semitism, but we don't really want to talk about that. And really it's okay. And maybe it's actually Israel's fault. And all of those things that are coming up, you can see this divide happening again very strongly. Very strongly. This is exactly what happened in the year approximately 167, 166 BCE, as Antiochus started to build up his chutzpah, as they definitely did not say back then, his chutzpah in Judea. Anyway, eventually, even overwhelmingly, most of the seculars join the zealots and say, we're going to fight. We're going to fight because he can't do this. You can't mess with our Temple Mount this way. You wanted to outlaw circumcision. Fine, I wasn't so into that. You wanted to outlaw Torah study. Fine, that was really for the crazies who lived in Modi'in. Anyway, I wasn't such a Torah scholar. Fine. But once you do this, you don't mess with me. And now it's about civil liberties. And now it's about things that I needed, about freedom. And now I'm going to fight. And now I'm going to align with my Jewish people. And all of a sudden, everyone becomes very, very, they become zealots, right? And they fight. And they fight the Greek Seleucid army. That's what they do. And they win, which is even more impressive. The military victory which they won was actually in the 1948 and 1967 wars, was actually, there were military strategists who studied these accounts of the wars of the Maccabees, the Judean wars, so as to see how one could access Jerusalem, given all the hills and the narrow passes where you would be sitting ducks. That was actually part of the strategy, was to know what the Maccabees had done, 2,100 years earlier. Anyway, they win. There's a problem with winning, and that's now you have to govern. And the Maccabees were very good at riling people up and getting them all hot and bothered and ready to go and ready to fight when there was an external tyrant, Antiochus. The problem was they became that tyrant. The wars ended around 163-ish, 162 BCE. And the Maccabees swept through the land that they had conquered, which, by the way, was a very small piece of land, much smaller than current day Israel. They swept through with a series of edicts of forced circumcision. They basically said, it is now the law that you must be circumcised, and anyone who was not, regardless of the age, will be circumcised. They came through with all sorts of temple regulations and taxes and an incredibly militant religious law. And they became very quickly very unpopular. They also became very poor. And the way that they fixed the poverty piece of it, and all of this happened between let's say 160 and 60 in 100 years, which is not a lot of time, right? They raised money by selling the high priesthood to people who were not necessarily Kohanim. Sorry, Gordy. And this it was obviously corrupt. It was obviously against the very religion that they had claimed that they were upholding. They became incredibly unpopular. Meanwhile, don't forget, the Greek Empire was declining, the Roman Empire was rising, and eventually surrounding Rome, surrounding Judea was this Roman Empire, and eventually they had to play ball with them. And part of that is a much more complicated story, but part of that was a person whose mother had converted Judaism that the Romans installed as a sort of prelate governor who was King Herod. That's how we transition from the Maccabees to Herod. Herod has in his ancestry the Maccabees. They became incredibly like Herod. They became incredibly paranoid that someone was going to run them out of town. And so they became more brutal as dictators and as authoritarian dictators so as to hold on to their power. This is all within 100 years that this happened, before the rise of Herod and the real entry of Roman governance into Judea. This is essentially what happened. In that 100 years, I'm going to guess that the sages Hillel and Shammai's great-grandparents lived. Probably their grandparents as well. Because Shammai and Hillel operated just before the year 0 into just after the year 0. Okay? So when it became time to decide on the place of the story and the festival of Hanukkah in rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, it was less than 250 years before was the Maccabean Wars. And the Maccabees in those intervening 200 years had been decidedly unpopular, incredibly unpopular, such that it had sort of colored the way in which the miraculous military victory of the Maccabees in the year 162 had been remembered, right? At which point the narrative of Hanukkah was not, let's light menorahs and let's spin dreidels and stuff like that. The narrative of Hanukkah was, this is what we get when we put religious zealots in charge of a corrupt temple, which, by the way, fit very well in the narrative of the Pharisees who had felt ostracized from the corrupt temple practices of the Sadducees, who were their opposing political party, I guess you would say. The Pharisees became Judaism as we now know it. And so if the Pharisees are the ones making the decision of what gets into the Talmud, which they are, then you can be certain that they are not going to lionize a group of people who remind them of the Sadducees that they just fought to win this whole thing internally on the political scene. That is Hanukkah. Now here, I'm going to pause for a second and ask you a question. If I tell you what happened to the Maccabees after the miraculous oil and war and all the other things that happen, does it ruin Hanukkah for you? That's my question. I'm going to unshare here, or I'm going to try to unshare. I'm going to ask that question. Did I just ruin Hanukkah for you? Go ahead, Gordy.
No, because I knew this before, but it was still a military victory, and it was a miraculous victory. So to know that, that famous phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, the Maccabees just lived up to that. So it does put a little bit of a dent in it.
Right. It's a little bit of a tarnish, right? And you can imagine if Hillel said, I'm imagining Hillel having some Yiddish aphorism of where the descendants of the Maccabees can go and what part of their body their head should be up, right? Okay, but I'm imagining that Hillel speaking Yiddish is already ridiculous, but you can imagine if he grew up with that the people who became Hillel's disciples would not have been so excited to especially closer to they certainly wanted to acknowledge the military victory, but to tell this story and to talk about the Maccabees like they were so wonderful, and to decide, by the way, to put the books of the Maccabees in the canon of the Bible, which they decided not to. All of these things, you can understand them a little better because they had a very different story of Hanukkah, which was much more about absolute power corrupting absolutely and much less about oil and dreidels. Anyone else? Any other thoughts or comments before we move on to a couple of other narratives like this? And then we'll go from there. Kathy, do you want to say something?
Well, we don't tell the final chapter of the Purim story either because it would put a damper on the evening.
Right. Well, we do read it.
We don't discuss it though.
Yeah. So, right. So chapter 9 of the Megillah is pretty rough. Basically, King Ahasuerus says, okay, Haman was going to kill all of you. Now you get to kill all the Persians. Go, 75,000 in 2 days. Right? That's not the part that we dance about. We're going to get to that dancing about that in before we're done here.
Okay.
So you can see the tension that we feel in this moment. Now I'm going to share with you another story. So here we go. This is a story that those of you who are in Shul, you heard me share about this. I'm going to do it very fast because some of you were in Shul. So this is another story. This is the story of Esau and Jacob. Rabbinic tradition loves Jacob, hates Esau. Esau is aligned with Rome. Rome destroyed the Second Temple. Basically 100 years after the story that I just told you with King Herod. It was 100 years later, and that was it. So and so it's impossible in the rabbinic understanding and narrative that Esau could ever be a nice guy. So here's the context of this story. Jacob, I think most of you probably are familiar with some parts of this story. Jacob convinces Esau to sell him his birthright. Jacob has to connive to actually get the birthright. Esau realizes that in short order later when he comes in for his blessing and Isaac has already blessed Jacob. And so he gets a second-rate blessing. Esau says, I'm going to kill you, Jacob. Jacob runs. He doesn't try to reconcile. His mother, Rebecca, says, get out of here. 20 years go by and both brothers have made a life for themselves. Jacob has 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, has a bunch of kids. Esau himself has a large family and wealth and things like that. And they are now going to reunite. The last thing Jacob heard when Jacob was leaving his ancestral home was his brother saying, I'm going to kill you. That's the last thing he heard. And now he's going to reunite with that brother. He's nervous about this. He divides his family into 2 camps, thinking if he slaughters one, at least I'll have the other. He puts himself separate from both of those camps. And then Esau surprises him by being a pretty nice guy. And he comes and they run towards one another and Jacob is still nervous and they hug And you can imagine the hug where, Esau's sort of face is buried he burrows his face in Jacob's neck, in the crook of Jacob's neck. And the rabbis say, that's impossible. Esau's a bad guy in our story. He has to stay a bad guy. There's no way he couldn't be a bad guy. And so the rabbis note that there's a scribal emendation in most Torahs that have dots over the word for kissing Jacob on his neck, Esau kissing Jacob on his neck. And so it says, oh, the reason those dots are there is certainly because that's not what happened. He wasn't going to kiss him. He was going to bite him. And the way that they do this, can you see my cursor here? So that letter there and that letter there, that's a kuf and a kaf. They say it's only one letter different. That must be what it is. That Esau was going to bite him on the neck and kill him, and God turned his neck into stone so that to protect the good guy Jacob from the bad guy Esau. That's what it must have been. It could not have been a genuine moment of forgiveness and reuniting. This is what we call confirmation bias. The rabbis have already decided that they hate Esau, that Esau hates them, that Esau is Rome, that Rome destroyed the temple, and therefore reading backwards, anything that Esau ever did has to have been with bad intention, and therefore he must have been biting him and not kissing him. That's the way it works. That is confirmation bias. I have a story, and nothing you're going to say is going to change me from my story. By the way, you can imagine that Hanukkah might work the same way. Until you have, as Gordy said, the perspective of history, it's really hard. If your grandparents were saying, those Maccabean schmucks, you can't, that's my Yiddish that Hilla was using, right? Okay. That you can't, that you absolutely can't understand a manner in which the Maccabees are heroes, right? It's the same thing. It's this idea that once we have our narrative, we can't depart from that narrative despite and with any proof to the contrary. This is what has been known as creating our myths, right? And I'm not going to go through all of this right now. I'm mindful of the time, but the idea is that our world is organized by narratives and stories that bring holiness to some things and enmity to other things. And those stories become so ingrained in our kishkas that's it. And anything else has to fit into that. And if we choose to rewrite or reject a myth, it becomes an incredibly disorienting, difficult, and even painful moment in our society. By the way, I believe, and we're going to get to this in the punchline in just a moment, this is what is going on in society constantly, but in a way right now that is incredibly fast-paced and jarring for many people, no matter which side of the myth you're on. We are being forced to reinvestigate and recreate and question our basic foundational myths. And these myths are, when I say myth, by the way, I never want you to say just a myth. When I say a myth, I mean a foundational story. Those stories, whether they are true or not, they contain the power of truth in a very significant way. They organize our world. Our experience of the world is a complex transaction between what comes to us from out there and the way we structure or read it. Myths are the spectacles, meaning the glasses, the spectacles that enable us to see order in what would otherwise be confusion. We may never be able to stand outside of the myth to measure its correspondence with reality, for we can never have a totally amythical perception of that reality. We can't be outside of it. Myths create communities. The stories that we have, and when I say myth, I'm not saying that it's false. Again, I'm saying that this is a foundational structuring story of the way we are. We believe that the Maccabees were right because ultimately Antiochus was persecuted so much that he convinced the vast majority of Jews, even the most secular Jews, that the Maccabees were right. But if you were living in 166 BCE, you thought the Maccabees were crazy. That was your narrative of the Maccabees. It took Antiochus putting an idol in the courtyard and pigs in an idol in the temple and pigs in the courtyard for you to start to say, maybe my story's wrong and theirs is right. Right? That's what this is. That's the myth that we're talking about. And it becomes incredibly jarring. And what is the result? The result is out and out, complete and utter war. And after the war, it's political chaos because the Maccabees end up being lionized as these heroes, and that becomes the new standing narrative. That becomes the new myth, is that the Maccabees were right and that they're heroes. And then what happens over the next 100 years? That myth gets destroyed because the Maccabees force circumcision on 20-year-old men. They enforce Torah study. They become corrupt. They say we're here for the purity of the temple, and then they sell the high priesthood. These become evidence, and you can imagine that a number of people, we'll call them the Sadducees, were refused to change their myth about the Maccabees. The Pharisees refused to accept that myth, and that led to essentially civil war. By the way, there's another group that said that both the Pharisees and the Sadducees were corrupt and were not worthy of being the carriers of God's message of kindness and prophetic need to heal the sick and protect the underdog. Those people followed a guy, you may have heard of him, kind of changed the world. His name was Jesus. That's when this was all happening. Okay, so now I want to give you one, and I purposefully do not have a citation on this. And the reason there are tons of square brackets on this is because I took a columnist, and don't Google keywords here because you're going to know who it is, and it's going to no cheating on this one. I took keywords out because I think when you take keywords out, you're going to see how difficult it is to decide whether this was someone who was pro or anti-Trump after Trump's first election. And I'm doing this not as a political statement. I'm doing this as a sense that we all should have a little humility on this. Okay? So I'm going to read this, and I want you to imagine it both as something you agree with and as maybe something you don't agree with, and whether this person basically tried to undo his confirmation biases in his writing. Okay, and so he starts out, he goes, I've gone on a listening campaign. I've been thinking a lot about the best imaginable voter who voted in opposition to me. Now, obviously, his conversation in this is right after Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Okay, so this is the one who cringed at everything cruel, vulgar, and misogynistic, but this voter needed someone to change the systems that are failing her. She needed someone to change the public school system that serves the suburban children of professors, journalists, and lawyers, but has left her kids underskilled and underpaid. By the way, this right here could be, this second paragraph could be someone who was campaigning on behalf of Republicans or Democrats. She needed some way to protect herself from the tech executives who give exciting speeches about disruption, but don't know anything about the people actually being disrupted. This voter wants leaders tough enough to crack through the reigning dysfunction. This voter wants a philosophic change of course to create a new deal that will win over Black and Hispanic voters. By the way, you should not know at this point with any certainty whether this voter is a Republican or a Democrat. That's why this is difficult. It's silly to treat politics and governance purely on cultural grounds as a high school popularity contest where my sort of people denigrates your sort of people. Whether it's reforming in immigration or trade policy, the governing challenge is going to be astoundingly hard and complicated. Surely this is not the moment to get swept up in our own moral superiority, but rather to understand the specificity of the proposals and to offer concrete amendments and alternatives to address the same problems. Finally, surely a little universal humility is in order. Maybe you can do better than responding with the sentiment, sadly, the country isn't good enough for us. By the way, we heard that sentiment on both extremes of both sides of the aisle. There will be plenty of time to be disgusted with bigotry, narcissism, and incompetence. It's tempting to get so caught up in the outrage du jour that you never have to do any self-examination, but let's be honest, it wouldn't kill us critics to take a break from our never-ending umbrage to engage in a little listening. Now, I gave you a little bit of the context, namely that it happened right after Donald Trump's first election. So you can understand some of it, but would you agree that it is difficult to know whether this person is speaking from the right looking left or the left looking right? That is because this person is speaking against confirmation biases, saying both sides have a narrative that demonizes the other side and says that the country under that other side isn't good enough, says that we are the outsider, says that we need a new type of governing, a new type of deal, a new deal. Both sides, especially in the most populist approach to both sides, were saying very, very similar things. They had the same narrative going in opposite directions. In a moment, I'm going to tell you who the person was, but any responses to it before we move on? Any thoughts? Gordy, go ahead.
Always me, sorry. I can't imagine a Republican would ever use the word New Deal. I mean, they abhorred it when Roosevelt introduced it. So.
I'm not going to say anything yet. So the voter that is being imagined would never use the word New Deal. Okay, go ahead, Josh.
I didn't cheat, but I think it must be Stacey Abrams down here in Georgia.
I'm not going to say anything until we give some people other, but that is fascinating in and of itself. Go ahead. I'll just say that. I took out the sort of outing characteristics of the thing. That's why there's so many square brackets and ellipses. Larry, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just say that this is a problem of both parties. I think in particular, being a Democrat, it's a problem of the Democratic Party in, being like the description here.
So now I'm going to tell you, David Brooks, center right of center, depending on who you're asking. David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, has originally appeared in the New York Times. I believe the date was November 22nd, 2016. It's eye-opening, isn't it? David Brooks, Gordy, to answer your question, is imagining a Republican who wants a New Deal. Not the same New Deal that it is before the squad came up with the Green New Deal and everything like that. But that's why when I reread this article, when I reread this column, I go, oh my God, it's such a red herring that pushes you the other way, right? It's such a decoy that throws you the opposite direction to say it. But that's exactly the challenge. Exactly the challenge is to say that we both, whoever you are, and whichever side the other is, has a narrative about the other. And he went through this campaign to try to imagine and actually hear the other side in their best intended manner, as opposed to the villainizing. Now, I'm going to get to that in a second, because obviously there are times when Tevye comes in and you say there is no other hand, and that steps across the line, and this is anathema to who we are as a society and all of those things. And I'm going to get to all of that because that's really important. But until you get to that point where we have stepped over lines that shall not be crossed, until you get to that point, we're in a zone of simply differing narratives. And one of the things that pushes us to that point is the confirmation bias that allows us to villainize the other, that allows us to see a hug as a bite. Any comments on that before I move forward?
Just one about David Brooks. He's always been described as a conservative, but I tend to think of him as a pretty smart moderate. And he was influenced by his time probably living in Toronto.
Of course he was, Gordy. Come on.
Good Canadian.
I have one more slide for you, so I'm going to share this in a second. I would say in the time, it's interesting how people shifted on the spectrum over the last, let's call it 8 years. In the time that this was right in 2016, he was mostly considered, I think he is a moderate. I think that people to the left of him think that he's right-leaning, and people to the right of him think that he's left-leaning, which makes him frankly interesting to me in these conversations. I think relative to most, he's a moderate. And it's interesting where he finds commonality, right? He had certain commonalities with Bret Stephens, specifically on his analysis of the later Trump stuff, and he had commonality with people on the left as well. One more slide, folks. One more slide. Here we go. All right. So now, to hit all of the red flag hot button issues in one slide. How do you like that? The model of differing narratives could help us understand others' perspectives, assuming best intentions by all. That's a really important assumption that sometimes gets thrown out of the conversation in so many areas of debate and divisiveness. Holiday narratives, folks. I'm gonna push every button right now. Okay, I'm gonna fly through them in a way that I think everyone, I hope, will be squirming. The conversations about Columbus Day and what that meant, and Thanksgiving, both, what that meant for the indigenous peoples who lived here and what that was. But also the counter narrative that virtually every country in the history of the world, I cannot think of a situation where someone came in to a completely desolate and uninhabited place that had no claim by any human being whatsoever, any known historical holiday, and said, oh, this would be a nice place to live because it doesn't impinge on anyone else's rights, diseases, natural resources, ancestral burial grounds, or any of those things. So, like, on the one hand, Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, the narratives of them clearly leave out a critical piece that we as Americans should own. And on the other hand, it is just the work of forming a nation. Sigid, if you know what Sigid is, it's a holiday recognized as a national Israeli holiday. It's of Ethiopian origin. Could you imagine what the Ethiopian Jews, the Sigid it's the, now I'm forgetting, I think it's the 40th day after Yom Kippur. It's the 40th day after Yom Kippur, observed in Ethiopian times with sacrifice and some reflection and things like that, like how are we doing in the year so far kind of thing. Could you imagine Ethiopian Jews who did not know that the temple had been destroyed, coming and kissing the ground of Jerusalem when they were brought to the Holy Land? They had been calling out to the storks that had been flying northward over Ethiopia for hundreds of years, saying, stork, stork, you're heading in the direction of Jerusalem. Tell us how Jerusalem's doing, because they thought the temple was still up. They had been we don't know if they're the 10 lost tribes, but they had been disconnected from the Jewish world before the Romans destroyed the temple. The question of Juneteenth, which we dealt with in a prior last June, we dealt with in a prior learning, and the idea of what that meant for emancipation. And yes, the question of Yom Yerushalayim. Obviously, there are multiple narratives that animate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is clearly the case. Terrorism is one of those things that does not assume best intentions by all. So let me be clear that terrorism is not a valid way of expressing a counter narrative to Israeli triumphalism. However, when there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who walk through Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem on Yom Yerushalayim, purposefully chanting death to the Arabs, that is not the way. I believe that Yom Yerushalayim is a day that arguably has more religious significance than Yom HaAtzmaut. The idea of there being a Jerusalem where Jews can go to the Kotel and other holy sites, I mean, come on. It is incredibly important. But the narrative that inspires people in their zealotry to say death to the Arabs who dare live in this place that they too have been living in, that is not a narrative that helps our cause of a legitimate and peaceful claim to a united Jerusalem. That's not helpful. I'll skip down to the quote that Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a centrist himself, said, "Peace will come when the Palestinian looks at the Jew and says, I know that Shechem and Bethlehem are central to the story of your people, and so I honor that you seek peace so much that you're willing to forgo control over those lands." And when the Jew looks at the Palestinian and says, I know that Yaffo and the Galilee are central to the story of your people, and so I honor that you seek peace so much that you're willing to forgo control over these lands. What we're asking, what Yossi Klein Halevi is asking people to do, is to reinvestigate and even sacrifice part of their own sacred narrative. Whether or not you agree with that narrative is actually irrelevant, because it's the other's narrative, assuming that they do not seek to, assuming, of course, that terrorism, which steps over the line, is not the mechanism by which you enforce your own narratives by killing others. But this is true about other narratives as well. There has been vaccination hesitance in the United States and in Israel, and COVID response and risk tolerance. All of these things are fueled by narratives. Those narratives can be patently false, but in a community like the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel that values fertility and babies so much, if even a rumor comes out that the vaccine, false rumor that the vaccine can cause infertility comes out, it was almost impossible to get people in the ultra-Orthodox communities at first vaccinated. Almost impossible. And all of these things are true. By the way, it's also true of Kenosha and other race-inspired, and I look at how many words I had to use to protests, rallies, violence, property damage. All of these things are because there is a narrative. Now, some of those narratives step over a line. Not all intentions are genuine, right? That's the classic quote that says that a machloket l'shem shamayim, a debate of different narratives that is for heavenly purposes, meaning not to destroy or to denigrate, that is one that is worthwhile considering. But one that tears apart or destroys or is enforced by violence to others is not one. And that's where the Maccabees got themselves in trouble. They had a great narrative that Antiochus was a persecutor, that he was destroying Jewish continuity, and not only destroying Jewish continuity, he's destroying Jews. That was a narrative that it took a while to catch on because of the secularism of most Jews, but it eventually caught on. The narrative that didn't catch on was, therefore, we should force circumcise everyone who didn't get circumcised during that secular time. You can see how these processes and the way that the biases that are set up by our narratives really cause problems. And what David Brooks asks us to do is to have just enough humility to say, assuming this person, it does not seek my destruction or insecurity, which, by the way, as events unfolded over the next 8 years after David Brooks wrote this article, that was not fully clear, right? We saw that culminating on January 6th, right? But what David Brooks was not speaking to the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. He sort of saw those people are gone beyond the pale. David Brooks is speaking to the people who had a narrative, whatever it may be, that caused them to vote in a way different than he. Now, at some point in time, it became beyond the pale for more and more people, as we saw. That resulted, by the way, in Trump's defeat, right? For some people, it did not get to that point, and we saw January 6th. But the challenge that I think we face as a society is this idea that if your narrative is different from the mine, then by necessity, it cannot be l'shem shamayim. It cannot be for the sake of heaven. It must be evil. You must be a Korach. You can't be a Hillel or a Shammai. And that, I think, is the way that societies destroy themselves. Ask the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Neither one's made out so well. Pharisees a little better. Anyway, that's what I've got for you today. Happy to take comments or reflections on it. And I guess the moral of the story is we should have the humility to be constantly questioning our narratives enough that to hear the well-intentioned people who may disagree with us. Happy to have people unmute if you want to say anything or respond.
This was very enlightening. Thank you. Really good discussion. Really
Well,
good.
wonderful. Well, now I understand why Maimonides, one of our greatest of scholars, had to write a guide to the perplexed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, his whole thing is basically, I don't have the answers.
That's correct. That's what
Though I wouldn't accuse Maimonides of humility.
No, I guess not. I don't know. No, that's true.
The guy also, in addition to writing the Guide to the Perplexed, he also wrote a series of volumes called the Mishneh Torah, which basically made the claim that you don't need the Talmud anymore because of all the debates in the Talmud. I'll tell you the answers.
Answers, yes, that's right.
Right. He didn't suffer from humility. Let's just put it that way. By the way, he was almost excommunicated for that.
That's right. He was in trouble, making us think. Toda rabah.
Yasher koach.
Yasher koach. Oh, good. I'm glad I came today.
Have a good day, everyone.
A guten Tag, Alleman. Good to see everybody.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Take care. Take care. I'm ending. Have a good day.